Hello everyone and welcome to the second lecture on Huck 3007. This one, as you know, is about Macbeth, but it's also about a range of other texts, and I want you to have the PowerPoint open in front of you so that you can see what those texts are. I'm going to talk you through them one by one on the PowerPoint, and if you can think about the way that they're in dialogue with each other, that would be particularly helpful for this week. If you look at that first slide then, you can see that one of the things that I've suggested about the way the module works is that it is an intertextual module. It's about the way that texts are in dialogue with each other. So they respond to each other, they answer each other, they correct each other, they fight with each other, but also they echo each other. They collect items from previous texts and they redeploy them in new and exciting ways to tell new stories, sometimes to tell the same story over again, but with different emphasis, from a different viewpoint perhaps, from a different perspective, from a different character's angle. And maybe they intend the entire message of that text to be different, and for you to go back again to that first text and think, there are all sorts of things I didn't see there. So you'll have come across this idea in your studies before, I'm sure, but for this module it is particularly important to think about intertextuality, the ways that texts are in dialogue with each other. One of the key themes that holds the module together then is this intertextuality. It allows us to follow ideas and characters across time, and what I'm going to look at this week is a series of interlinked texts that are before Macbeth and lead up to Macbeth. There are also texts afterwards that we'll look at later on the module which respond to Macbeth, of course, and I can also give you loads of examples of those if you want to follow up in your own reading, or write your essay about something that isn't on the module but is about Macbeth. So there's loads of things that you can look at. The ones that I'm going to look at this week are two witchcraft acts, so two acts of Parliament, perhaps an unusual thing for a literary module, perhaps less usual for a history module even, but we're looking at the text of Acts of Parliament, Tudor Acts of Parliament in this case, from 1563 and then from 1604, the Jacobean Witchcraft Act. Then I want us to look at Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles from 1577. I want us to look at a news pamphlet, so like an early newspaper, called News from Scotland, which is about witches. I want us to look at King James's own book about witchcraft and magic, Demonology. And finally, of course, I want us to look at Macbeth. So if you can go on to the next slide. Here is a piece of text from the 1563 Witchcraft Act. This is its preamble, so acts tend to have a preamble where they lay out what the act is all about. It's a bit like the little bit of text at the start of this module, which says this is the way this module works. This act works in this way. This is why there is a Witchcraft Act in 1563. So Queen Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558. 1563, there is a Witchcraft Act brought in by the Queen and her ministers under the influence of a variety of different parties, and there is some debate about who those parties were. As always with an Act of Parliament, there are lobby groups who want this thing to be brought in, and there are people in Elizabeth's country, in Elizabethan society, who are keen to see witches stamped out. And they argue, and this is what the preamble says, that many fantastical and devilish persons have devised and practised invocations and conjurations of evil and wicked spirits, and have used and practised witchcrafts, enchantments, charms and sorceries to the destruction of the persons and goods of their neighbours and other subjects of this realm, and for other lewd intents and purposes contrary to the laws of Almighty God, to the peril of their own souls, and to the great infamy and disquietness of this kingdom. We'll come back to that word fantastical. It's a word that pops up in Macbeth. I think Shakespeare knew about this act. If he'd not read the text specifically, he knew that fantastical was a key word associated with witchcraft, and that's why he has one of his other characters use it in the play. Go look up who it is. These fantastical and devilish persons then, fantastical means a person who is obsessed with fantasy, a person who is full of imagination, is always devising new ways to get themselves into trouble in this case. These fantastical and devilish persons who are deluded by the devil, who are led astray by the devil, have devised and practiced invocations. So an invocation is a bit like a conjuration. It's when you call up a devil or a spirit. So you utter an invocation just as you would at the start of an epic poem. If you're a literature student, you'll have come across invocations at the start of epic poems when people say, oh, muses inspire me to do this. This is an invocation where you say, oh, devil, come up, rise up from hell, come and help me with something. These evil and wicked spirits then have been summoned by witches, and they will think of some of these as familiar spirits, the little animals that follow witches around, which you'll remember from our first lecture. And these witches have used and practiced witchcrafts, enchantments, charms and sorceries. So it's really quite interesting that they're trying to cover everything. They think of these things as slightly different. An enchantment it comes from the French chant, to sing. A charm is similar. It's a carmina from the Latin. It's a chanted or sung invocation or spell. A sorcery usually involves some kind of artifact or quite simple processes. They've done all of these magical things, they're naughty people, through the destruction of the persons and goods of their neighbours. So this is an act that focuses on the harm that you do to other people in the first instance. It's a criminal act to do witchcraft, and it is a criminal act because you're attacking other people, because you're seen to be attacking your neighbours. And they are your neighbours, they are immediate people in front of you, in the houses to the side of you. They're not people far away, they're not important politicians, for example, although there are fears about that in Elizabethan society. This is very much the kind of preamble to an act which suggests it's done for the people. It's done for you, the neighbours, to protect you from your other neighbour who may be a witch. And other subjects of the realm, so they may have attacked other people. And this is one of those legal coveralls, for other lewd intents and purposes. Lewd means ignorant, nasty, sinful. Contrary to the laws of Almighty God, so this is forbidden not only because you're harming your neighbours, but because God says you must not be a witch. To the peril of your own soul, if you do this, you will be damned. You will have handed yourself over to the devil. And finally, to the great infamy and disquietness of this realm. That's a very Macbethy phrase. We're looking at the health of the nation, the health of the realm, the area under the monarch. This is being corrupted, this is being destroyed by witchcraft. Again, I think this is an indicator that this is a text with which Macbeth will later be in dialogue. If you go on to the next slide, you can see what the penalties were for witchcraft. I think it's always important to pay attention to the real people who were witches and what happened to them. And in this case, it was some pretty unpleasant stuff, although it's going to get worse with the next Witchcraft Act that comes along. The 1563 Act says that if you're found guilty of practising witchcraft, this is what will happen to you. If any person or persons, after the 1st day of June next coming, use, practice or exercise any invocations or conjurations of evil or wicked spirits, to or for any intent or purpose, or else if any person or persons after the said 1st day of June shall use, practice or exercise any witchcraft, enchantment, charm or sorcery, that phrase again, whereby any person shall happen to be killed or destroyed, they shall suffer pains of death as a felon. So you can be executed for witchcraft under the terms of this first act. I believe we've discussed this already on the module. And it's for these reasons. You must not invoke demons or other evil spirits, even if in the form of a supposedly nice-looking little cat or toad, for any intent or purpose. They're quite concerned about other purposes which aren't harming the neighbours as well. So, for example, you could invoke a devil to come and help you find treasure. And you'll see back on the title slide of this lecture that I also talk about other things, other entities, other beings that you might be found invoking. Some of those are fairies. Fairies were very much involved in treasure hunting. And other kinds of spirits were thought to be involved in love magic. So you really mustn't invoke anything for any purpose, it makes clear. And if you do, and you happen to harm somebody to the extent that they die, they're killed or destroyed, then you will be executed. The Act also has lesser penalties. You can be imprisoned for a year if you haven't actually killed anybody. And that's quite an unusual punishment in Elizabethan times. It's unusual because it's expensive. You have to house people who are in a jail. Actually, in many ways, it's just easier either not to convict them in the first place or to execute them. At least that way, you're not responsible for their upkeep. So it's quite a lenient act in a way, even though it does promise death by hanging as a felon for these nasty offences. It also has a lesser penalty, which will not put on the slide, but you can look up separately, of imprisonment for a year if you haven't killed anyone. So it's important to bear that in mind, that balancing act that the act is carrying out between really extreme forms of punishment and mercy. The 1604 Act, however, does become much less merciful. And this is important because it is the act that's most close in time to Macbeth, which was probably written about 1605, 1606-ish, around the time of the Gunpowder Plot, if you think about it in those terms, but a couple of years after the Witchcraft Act, if you think about it in those terms. The 1604 Act comes in the year after King James comes to the throne in 1603, succeeding Queen Elizabeth. And he wants, partly because he's the author of Demonology, the work we're going to look at in a little bit in this lecture, partly for other reasons, because he thinks he's experienced witchcraft attack himself, and we'll also talk about that later on in this lecture. King James wants to toughen the penalties against witches. Now, how far this is up to him, how far this is up to his councillors and ministers and others, is again a thing that historians have debated, but what really matters is that the new Witchcraft Act comes in a year after James comes to the throne. And it's very clear about why. It is, as it says here on the slide, for the better restraining of the said offences and more severe punishing of the same. So he thinks the 1563 Act is too lenient. It had a Scottish version as well, so he's familiar with it as King of Scotland as well as King now of England as well. It's not hard enough. Be it further enacted by the authority aforesaid, and this is the government and the king, that if any person or persons after the said feast of St. Michael the Archangel next coming shall use, practice or exercise any invocation or conjuration of any evil or wicked spirit, or shall consult, covenant with, entertain, employ, feed or reward any evil or wicked spirit to or for any intent or purpose, my goodness, they're really covering everything here, or take any dead man, woman or child out of his or their grave or any other place where the dead body resteth, or the skin, bone or any other part of any dead person to be employed or used in any manner of witchcraft, sorcery, charm or enchantment, or shall use, practice or exercise any witchcraft, sorcery, charm or enchantment whereby any person shall be killed, destroyed, wasted, consumed, pined or lamed in his or her body or any part thereof, then that every such offender shall suffer pains of death as a felon or felons. Things have indeed tightened up a lot. There's a wider range of offences here, and there are two specific things that you also must not do. Not just about invocation now. You mustn't keep an evil spirit, a familiar. You mustn't do anything with it. You mustn't feed it, reward it, interact with it. Think about the ways in Macbeth that people interact with evil. I think this act is behind some of that. You also must not take any dead man, woman or child out of his or her or their grave. This is about necromancy. It's about using dead bodies. It's about communicating with the dead. It's a gory and nasty and physical and bodily witchcraft. And again, think about the witches in Macbeth and their use of parts of dead bodies. And if you are found doing any of this, doesn't matter if you killed somebody or what, if you just lamed them, upset them in some way, harmed their body in some way, you will be executed. So this act strengthens the penalties. If you have a look at the exercise next, I'd like you to read Stuart Clark's article in Version, Misrule and the Meaning of Witchcraft on the Ellie site, and I'd like you to consider some of the questions there. In light of his arguments, what kinds of inverted behaviour are being criticised here in the Witchcraft Act? What is it they want to stamp out? I'd like you to think about the choices that they're making between supposedly normal behaviours and activities and attitudes and abnormal, inverted ones. What's being feared and punished in each case and why?